with our next segment of Ask the Pastor. Today's question asks, what's the difference between expository preaching and exegesis and hermeneutics? These are all terms that this person had heard before but doesn't really know what they mean. Just know that a lot of people throw them around and just wanted some clarification on what they mean. And so I love this. So consider this a $1 word day. You guys get your $1 word award today as we do today's segment. So hold on tight. I'm going to try to explain them as clearly as I can so that you can walk away understanding why they're important and why they're things you should look for. So a lot of times in Christian circles, we will just say words and assume that someone else knows what we're talking about. And we need to be careful about doing that. Even if the meaning of these words and what they stand for is really important, we need to be more careful to make sure we explain why they're important. And so I know that a lot of times when people are encouraging people to find a church, they'll say things like, make sure that you go to a church that does expository preaching and exegesis of the scripture. And sometimes people just feel like, clearly I'm supposed to know this and I don't, but I'm too embarrassed to ask what it means. And so they just say, okay, and then they walk away. But what do we actually mean when we talk about expository preaching or exegesis and the idea of hermeneutics, which are all very fun words to say in the context of preaching? Well, let's talk about expository preaching first. Expository preaching is the idea of careful examination and explanation of the text verse by verse through the scriptures. Why is this an important thing for pastors to do and the important kind of preaching to sit under? It's because when you practice expository preaching, you go, as I said, verse by verse through the Bible and you don't skip anything. So the opposite of expository preaching would be topical preaching, where you kind of come with an idea of what you want to say, and then you kind of search the scriptures to find verses that you think support what you're trying to say, and then you kind of compile it all together and you preach that. I think there might be a time and a place for topical preaching that can be done well, but done consistently, repeatedly, people will tend to only focus on those sections of scripture which are easier to teach or are more palatable to the ear. And so they can avoid some of the hard aspects of scripture, which are still really important for people to hear. And expository preaching forces you to stay within the whole context of this book consistently week in and week out, so that every week your hearers are listening to the same book being preached in order to get the full scope and meaning and interconnectedness of the text. And so imagine, for instance, as an example of expository preaching, you're going through a tour of some historical site. And there are some parts of the history that are a little hard to grasp. And so the tour guide just says, well, we're just going to skip this one and we're going to go around to this other thing that I like more. You will start getting the feeling like, well, are they hiding something from me? Are they keeping something from me? Is that really not important? And so all of a sudden you are left with this blank of knowledge that you otherwise would have had if they had taken the time to walk you through and say, look, this is hard, but let's walk through this and explain what it means. And so the pastor has to do a lot of work on their end to prepare these sermons. And so in expository preaching, we have to take into consideration the whole context of the passage. We can't just cherry pick something out that sounds nice and make it say whatever we want to say. An example would be something like Philippians 4:13, for I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And then create a whole sermon about how we can be victorious in every aspect of our life as long as we have Christ to strengthen us. But that's not what Paul's talking about. If you look at the whole context of the letter of Philippians, which just so happens to be what we're preaching from here at Christ Community EPC, you see that Paul is in prison and he's languishing and he's suffering for the sake of the gospel. And he's actually explaining that the the secret to contentment that he's found, whether he is provided for or not, whether he's hungry or fed, whether he has shelter or he's imprisoned, is that he can endure suffering because Christ strengthens him to endure it. And so that is what expository preaching is. It's the methodical, verse by verse preaching of a book of Scripture. And topical, again, is coming in with a preconceived idea and finding verses throughout the Bible to try to support your view. The next term this person brought up was exegesis. What is exegesis? Well, the opposite of exegesis is eisegesis. And so when we talk about exegesis, it literally means to read out of something. And eisegesis means to read into something. Well, what's the difference here? Why is this important? It's because exegesis, when someone's exegeting the scripture, they're looking into what did the author intend? What was their purpose? What was their what context were they writing in? What would their original audience have heard? And in that way, we can begin to understand how to apply it to our own life. So we understand that the author had an intention. Obviously, God had his intentions, but the author also had an intention in writing these things. There was a context in which they were written, and that context informs our understanding of the text. And so we read out of the text its meaning. We understand that it has its own meaning inherent within it, and we try to draw it out of its place to see its meaning. And that means we take into consideration the literary context. Is this a letter? Is this poetry? Is this prophecy? Is this history? Is this parable? And understanding the literary context will help us understand the meaning and the intent of it. What about who was the original audience? What were the things they were going through and struggling with? What might Paul have been, or Paul or any of the other writers have been addressing in their situation? And we let those things determine the meaning of the text, whereas eisegesis means to read into something. And so it means we're coming with our own preconceived ideas and looking and trying to find them in the text that we're reading. And so that really we become the authority of the text and not the text itself, our authority. And so you may have been part of a Bible study at one point or another where a passage of scripture will have been read, and the question the person leading the Bible study would say is, what does this scripture mean to you? And then all of a sudden now you are the one who gets to determine the meaning and the import of the scripture. But the reality is the scripture can never mean what it never meant. And so we let the scripture speak to us. The meaning comes out of the text. The meaning doesn't come from us into the text. I remember when I was in college, we were called to do an analysis of Jane Eyre. And it was amazing the things that got really good grades that completely ignored the author's intention. One was a communist reading of Jane Eyre or something bizarre like that, which, was just meant to be kind of stark and controversial, but really didn't take into consideration the author's intent in the book. There's the famous painting, American Gothic, which, there's the picture of the farmer with the lady standing beside him. And many people in their interpretation of that painting, without consulting the author, were assuming that was a man and his wife, and it was kind of construing or presenting the gender roles of the Midwestern rural life. But in reality, that was a man and his daughter, which once the author explained that, or the painter of American Gothic explained that, began to alter people's understanding of the painting. So understanding what the author meant and letting the text speak out to us instead of us into it gives us a more accurate and authentic meaning of the text, and then gives us the proper tools we need to say, well, then how does this apply to our life today? And so again, expository preaching versus topical preaching. Expository preaching verse by verse through the Bible, staying within the context of a book, so that people are always in that world, always thinking about those cultural and literary and original audience pieces that shape our understanding of the text. And then exegetical preaching versus eisegetical preaching. Exegesis saying the scripture has something to say to us. There is an intent to this verse, and it doesn't just mean whatever we want it to mean, but it is authoritative and speaks to us. It's truth. We don't read truth into it. And so then the last term was the idea of hermeneutics. And this is another fun word you get to add to your tool belt today. And hermeneutics is the way we read and interpret things in the broad term. So you can have a good hermeneutic or a bad hermeneutic. You can have a consistent hermeneutic or an inconsistent hermeneutic. And so there are different ways of reading and interpreting the Bible that are helpful, and a lot of these things overlap. There's the historical hermeneutic, which seeks to understand the Bible in its historical context. There's redemptive historical, which is tracing God's redemptive purposes through the scripture. There's text critical, which is trying to understand the formation of the text throughout the ages, based on manuscript traditions and that sort of thing. And so there are multiple different ways that you can consistently read the scriptures. Some are more helpful than others. But the whole concept of hermeneutic is how we read and interpret the Bible. How is it that we approach it, and what lens are we viewing it through in order to try to understand its cohesion and its meaning for us? And so everyone has a hermeneutic. So anytime you read anything, you're reading, and as you seek to gain understanding from it, you're functioning in some form of hermeneutic. So when we talk about hermeneutics, we're just talking about how we read and understand the scriptures, which the idea of exegesis and expository preaching becomes kind of ingrained in the kind of hermeneutic we have. We believe that the Bible is an authority, that it has its own meaning given to it intentionally by God and by the author, the human author, that therefore we are to read for the context of the scriptures in order to understand them more clearly, and that we are not more insightful into the meaning of the scriptures because we're now in the 21st century. We don't know more than the author and the original audience did regarding what the text meant. And so hopefully this helps in thinking about these terms. Exegesis, expository preaching, hermeneutics. Congratulations if you made it all the way through this video. Hope this helped. I hope it gave you some better context for what people mean when they talk about these terms. If you have a question for us, as always, feel free to email me at pastorjeremy@christcommunitygf.com. That's pastorjeremy@christcommunitygf.com. If you're looking for a place to worship in Great Falls, we have a Bible study at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning. And then we have worship at 10:30. We invite you to come, join us, be part of what's going on here in Great Falls. And until next time, God bless. May you seek Him on your journey.